Success 1, 2, 3. All right, everyone. Welcome to Jfokus. Good morning to everyone. And today we're going to talk about an interesting topic which is really close to my heart. And you're going to know why in a couple of minutes. So the talk is called From Patchwork to Picasso and Refactoring 150 plus projects and what went wrong. Before we start, I want you to take a few seconds to just scan this because this allows you to directly give feedback to me and I can improve the talk later on. So you'll also see this at the end of the talk as well. So I'm going to give you just a couple of seconds, maybe 10 seconds. In the meantime, who are not scanning, how many of you have worked with Angular? Can I have? Ooh, everyone. Really happy to see that. Okay, good stuff. So let me ask you a question, a very existential question, I might say. What if you had cats? How many of you have cats? A couple of them, nice. What if you had 150 of them? And you're trying to walk them together. So as you can see, this probably would be the case if you do that in reality. And that's exactly how I felt when I was working on these projects, these 150 plus projects. For the next 40-ish minutes, that's what we are going to talk about. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Muhammad Ahsan. I'm originally from Pakistan. I've been living in Sweden for about 5 years now. I am a Google developers expert in Angular, which means that Google itself acknowledges my expertise in Angular, and I get to work closely with the Google teams, specifically around Angular. I'm right now working as a software architect at Scania since February last year, so I'm pretty new compared to my colleagues who have been there for 25 or 30 years. I'm just a newbie there. I'm also an author of 2 worldwide published books, namely the Angular Cookbook. If you have not seen this, by the end of this talk, you probably would be convinced to see this. I'm also a maintainer of a lot of open source libraries. Someone might have used this one already. It's called the NGX device detector. This is used by more than 5,000 projects on GitHub, and it has crossed 11 million installs so far. It basically detects what kind of device your Angular app is being run on. I'm also a tech enthusiast, so I like to hack quite a lot. And this is from last year at the Stockholm office at Google. And I won an AI hackathon with this really nice gentleman named Adam. And I'm also awarded a couple of times different things. For example, last year at JavaScript Poland, I was giving this award of Hero of Education because of the content I create. And I've also been featured by Google a couple of times, including this one, when I was closely working with an AI machine learning campaign with Google. And this was officially shared on the Google Cloud channel on LinkedIn. So in 2019, there's a publisher named Pact. How many of you heard about Pact already? Just a couple of them. So just like O'Reilly, we also have Pact as a publisher that publishes books. So they reached out to me for a video course on Ionic, and Ionic was pretty new back then, and it was one of the cool kids in town in which you can use Angular to create mobile applications for Android and iOS. And at that time, I actually thought that's super cool because I was fascinated by these people like John Papa, Dan Wallin, all the big names in Angular, and I was really impressed by them, and I wanted to do the same, create a course. But there was some challenges. And my family was not the challenge. But I used to live with my family back then in Pakistan, and that's very common. So you have a couple of couples in the same house, which means you most likely have one room to yourself. And that means that if I had to record something, I would actually do that in my bedroom. And I would do that just at night because that's the most peaceful time. Everyone is asleep. But there were some challenges, and the biggest challenge was I was newly married, so I didn't have too much furniture in the room. And if you have recorded anything in your life, you know that when you don't have furniture in your room, there's an echo. And even the slightest sound in my room would be recorded in a microphone. And whenever my wife would just roll while sleeping, I would be like, can you just not do that? Because I would have to re-record everything again. So I tried something else. I went outside in the living room, and since it was around night, I actually faced some challenges. like this one, almost in the morning. Or, since you can see there's a window there as well, something like this. It would be the milk guy distributing milk across homes. That's a thing in Pakistan, by the way. And that would be me whenever those kind of recordings would be ruined. So fortunately, 5 years ago, I moved to Sweden, and you can see how happy I was. Once I published the video course, I thought it's going to be money all over. I'm going to earn a lot of money, a lot of respect in the community because of the good course. But that was exactly the time when React Native came out and Ionic got pushed to the side. So the course did not really do well, and I was sad, to say the least. In 2020, they reached out again and they were like, can you write a book for us? And that was on Angular. And I had never written a book. I used to write a lot of articles on Ionic, on Angular, on web performance, but not a book. So long story short, it took over 10 months and we published it. We sold over 2,000 copies of the book. It got a really good rating on Amazon. I think it's 4.2 still. And then in late 2022, they reached out again and they were like, can you write a second version of this book? And at first I thought it's going to be easy because it's a second edition. That means the most of the content is going to be the same. It's not like a different set of applications or completely different content. But when I looked at the code base, that actually changed my mind because I knew I was in trouble. There were more than 150 projects that I created for my first book, and I had to upgrade all of them from version 12 of Angular to version 16. And if you know Angular, you know there is a predictable release frequency for Angular. Every 6 months, there is a major release. And between those, there are about 3 to 4 patches, which are minor. And then there are fixes as well along the way. So updating all the recipes looked like this when I actually started, because I was like, okay, this is going to take much more time. And the timeline I gave to my publisher was like, yeah, I can do that in 3 to 4 months. But then that didn't seem the case. So what did I do? I actually stumbled upon this really cool tool named NX Monorepositories. How many of you used NX? Just a couple of you. So if you learned something from this talk, or one thing, that would be to try to explore this one and see the benefits. So when I started with NX, I decided that I'm going to have one mono repository, and let's establish some terms here. When I say monorepo, I mean a GitHub repository. When I say NX workspace, that means that it's a NX toolchain workspace that can have multiple applications within that, or multiple libraries, or both. So that means that those 150 projects became 2 NX workspaces. That also means that if in the future I had to update them, which I will be doing actually in a few months or later this year, I only have to update 2 workspaces instead of 150 projects. So I created one workspace for starter and one for final. And that is because my book is written in a way that is, in my opinion, the most practical way, where you have a problem, you follow the recipe, and then you get the solution. So we have the start state of every application in the book, and we have the final state of every application in the book as well. In theory, it would look something like this. So we would have the monorepo, the GitHub repository, and then we would have a start folder, a final folder, and inside those we would have the folders for chapters, because there are about 14 chapters in the book. We have animations, we have unit testing, end-to-end tests, performance optimizations, component communication, NGRX, you name it. So I needed my projects to be inside the chapter folders for the readers to easily go and pick and find things. So let me ask you this question. How many of you love or like UI UX, being front-end developers? Okay. How many of you advocate for it? Talk to others about this. Okay, the number is getting less. How many of you advocate for a great developer experience for others? Nice, really good. So we are going to talk about developer experience as well. So with the current NX structure that I just mentioned, we have in my VS Code, for example, the start folder and the final folder. And then to run any of these recipes or projects, my readers would have to do something like this. They would have to navigate into the start or final folder. They would then have to run the nx serve command, and they would have to give this name. I want you to closely look at the name. The name includes the chapter as well as the recipe name. Now, as developers, we want to be dry. Not this one, but you know what I mean. But also remember, we need a really good developer experience. And I wanted the developer experience to be good, not just for my readers, but for myself as well. Remember, I'm right now at the point in the story where I am about to migrate these projects. I haven't done anything yet. Now I have to create those 150 projects myself. So we really needed a really good developer experience for myself as well. So I had two major goals when it comes to the naming convention or how the readers would run these applications. The first one was to not do this, not to go and cd into a folder and then run the chapter name dash recipe name. Because when you create an NX project and you give it some folder paths, it basically gives the name including the folders and replaces slashes with dashes. So I wanted them to do this instead. That was the first goal. So instead of cding into a folder, just run it from the project's root, so eliminating one step. So for the start folder or recipe in the start folder, you could just run this command, npm run serve and the name. Or if you wanted to run the final version of the project, then you just give as a positional argument as final. And the second goal was not to even use the chapter number at all. And the reason for that is the whole book has unique recipes. I don't talk about the same thing in different chapters. So every project is unique. That means if my readers can just remember the name of the project, that's good enough for them. They could just run npm run serve, cc inputs, outputs, and then they see the component input output communication recipe. So for the first goal, it was really easy. I didn't want to do cd, so I wrote a script that cds into the folder and runs the command. And then I added it in the package.json, so they could run npm run blah blah blah, and that would run a shell script behind the scenes. With this change, now I could simply run npm run serve with the big name, or for the final one, this, as we discussed. Now I had to focus on the second goal, and the second goal was not to use the chapter number at all because every recipe name is unique. So to avoid using the chapter name, I had three possibilities. As I mentioned, I'm right now creating these applications, so I wanted to enable my reader to run a certain way of running the command. So how do I create my project so they don't have to mention the chapter number? I had three options. One, when I'm creating the application, before I create it, I somehow manipulate the name so the readers won't have to use the chapter number. The second possibility is that I create my project and then I rename it manually or automatically somehow. And the third one was to give up and writing a PHP book instead. I don't know if that would be easier. I chose the second approach. Why? I have no clue. But at that time, that actually made sense to me. And I was like, okay, let's give it a try and let's see what happens. So coming back to the problem at hand, this is the goal. We wanted to run npm run serve and just the recipe name. So for this, I created an NX plugin. An NX plugin is something that is similar to whenever you're trying to add something into an NX workspace. For example, you're creating an Angular application that is done via an NX plugin. If you want to create a Nest.js or a Node.js backend application in NX workspace, you are using essentially a plugin. So there are already a lot of NX plugins out there which are created either by the NX team or other companies. So I created a plugin because when I was creating these applications, this is how I would do it. I had two folders, start and final. I would cd into the folder, and I would run this huge command that would say, NX generate an Angular application with this particular folder. Now, if you remember, since we are using the folder name / recipe name, it generates this particular name for the whole application. And this is really hard to remember. That's the problem I wanted to solve. I didn't want this chapter number to be there. So the plugin I created had two main things. And this is the gist of this talk, what I'm trying to share with you. We have something called generators in NX, and we also have something called executors in NX. When you're using generators, you're essentially generating something like an app, like a library, like a component, service, pipe, whatever that is. An executor is like a Node.js script that can run afterwards. So I used the generator to create my application. the first thing that the generator would do is would create an application like how I want it. For example, it would include Tailwind CSS into it. It would include certain linting tools. It would have a certain kind of HTML structure. So all of my applications in the future that I'm going to create are going to be generated in a certain pattern. Alongside that, it also added one tiny little thing into the project JSON. So every app I'm creating, I'm going inside the project JSON and adding an executor for the future. And we're going to talk about what that future is. So the first step is the generator runs, creates the application, and adds this executor in the package JSON. In terms of code, it looks something like this. If you see here, we have the project JSON that is being rendered, and then we have the rename key there, which is adding my plugin's executor right there. And then it also has some arguments. It has the chapter number, and it also has the recipe name. I need that because I want to rename the app everywhere applicable. Finally, this is an example of what the project JSON could look like. The second step is to actually run that executor. So the executor script runs, it looks at the project JSON, it figures out what is the chapter number and what is the recipe name, and then it replaces that with just having the recipe name. I'm not going to go into too much into the code, but after writing this plugin and having the generator and the executors, I could basically run this command, npm run create, then I would give the chapter number, I would give the recipe name, and then I would give the title I want to see in the header of each application. So I would run the bash script, that would run the generator first, and then it would run the executor. If we dissect this command, this is what it means. So npm run create goes into my root package JSON, runs the creation script, then we have the positional argument for chapter number, recipe name, and then the header. So this is like a trimmed version of what the bash script basically does, but it creates my application and runs and renames everything. Which means that for this particular folder structure, where we have the mono repo, we have the start and final workspaces, and then we had chapter folder and then the recipe folder, I could now just run this, npm run serve and cc on changes. And that would actually serve my application as it is. For renaming, there are specific files that it changed. It went to the project JSON, it also looks at the annex JSON as well, and it renames all of them. If you remember, our goal was a really good DX, and I got that to some point. Now, to be honest, at that time I was like, okay, this is super cool. I built something nice, and now I can fasten up the speed that I'm creating this application for. And I also conquered a fear that I always had for these things called schematics, which is automating the process of generating, executing, and also modifying your project in a certain way. And I never worked with that before. And just as I was feeling enlightened, there was another problem that knocked the door. And we had a thing called consistency. So I had to create 150 projects, and I wanted all of them to be consistent because I didn't want to copy paste all my styles or my structures. I wanted them to look nice and same, and I didn't want to maintain that on a longer period of time. So the idea was to have the same sort of nav bar or header across all the projects, which could look something like this. So we would have the Angular logo there, we would have the title there, and then we would have an info button there, which I could then use to, for example, get feedback on specific projects from the readers. And what you see down there is the dynamic or main content. So whenever I have to work on a new project, I would just run the command, the app would be built automatically with the header, and then I would just have to code the main content here, which is still consistent all of the projects. So what I could do, or I thought I could do, is I would create a generator having the index HTML, because when you talk about consistency, what do you think could be there? You could have the same fonts for all of your applications. You could use some icons like a CDN for that, or material icons or whatever. And then you would also want the styles to be the same as well. So there are two main components when you're working with the Angular applications in terms of HTML. You have the main index HTML, and then you have the app component HTML. So for my generator, I gave templates for these two files. When we look at the index HTML, you will find that we have the HTML tag, the head, and then you can see all those things like fonts, icons, all of those things are right there. If you look at the body also uses a prefix as well, but we can ignore that for now. When we go to the app component HTML, that's the structure of my application. So at the top, you see the toolbar, which has the Angular logo. And I want you to pay close attention to how the logo is written there. So it's an image, essentially, which has a source, which is essentially a base64 string. Then we have this main container at the bottom. And whenever I create a new application, all I had to do was just start with the main container, and everything else is there. But we only discussed the HTML part so far. What about the biggest fear of web developers? This guy. What about the CSS? How can we make sure that the styles are consistent throughout? Even if we have the structure consistent, how can we make the CSS consistent? And this is exactly when I created a library in my plugin. So I already had this plugin, and I'm going to show you the code later on as well. But I added this library in my plugin, and I called this I think ng cookbook UI. And I added this global.scss here. The fun part was, as soon as I created a library, created this global CSS in my package and exported it, made sure that this is packaged and can be used in the start and final folder, I could actually add that to my generator. So every time I would create an app, not only it would rename it, but now it would also add this CSS file or SCSS file in the project JSON. So I didn't have to even include this in all of my 150 projects. I'm creating an application, automatically this CSS is there. And then if I had to change anything in the styles, I would just go and change my global CSS in my library, rebuild it, and everything is there. So I didn't have to maintain the global styles anymore. The best part was, inside of 150 projects, I'm just doing this for 2, just for the start and final workspaces. And the result was this. So this is the final output of all the applications that I had. So you have a header there, you have the Angular logo there, and the content that you see in the main place is dynamic for every application. But every application has the same thing. This was super nice. And just as I thought everything was like butterflies and sunshine, something big happened. Can someone remember what is the biggest thing that happened last year with Angular? Material 3? Standalone components. Yes, and now the standalone components, if I upgrade Angular, they already have some schematics that update them. So it's kind of easy. But what I've told you so far, there was something that actually made everything worse. And that was this. If you remember, we had 150 projects that I had already created, and all of them had the old logo, which was a base64 string inside an image tag, and now I was left with 150 projects. This is what we had. So now I have 150 plus instances of exactly this that I have to update. And when you think about it, you could be like, you can just go and replace this with the VS Code, or use a regex, do something like that. But if I do it right now, I might have to do it later on as well. How do I make it so that I don't have to struggle with this? So first of all, like a good developer, I compose myself. I accepted I'm stupid. And then I thought about this. The first thing that came to my mind was, okay, I'm just going to go to my app component HTML template, and I would replace this with a plugin library or a component from my library. So even if in the future I had to change something, I would just change the component in my plugin. And if it's being used in all the applications, it's updated there. So I wanted to change that to this using the ng cookbook UI header and providing the title and the name. But I wanted to do this automatically. I didn't want to do this manually. So if that sounds good, it's actually not. Because the problem with this was the time I was about to push the button, publish it to the whole world out there, and Angular changed their logo, which means that I already had created my projects. So I couldn't use my generator code because the generator only runs when you generate an application. So it was too late. I already had created the applications. And then what about my 150 cats with the old Angular logo that nobody loves anymore? So I started thinking about the solution. And my main questions were, how do geniuses at the Angular team or NX solve this issue when they have to go through the entire workspace and update? Because NX releases migrations or updates all the time, especially when there's a new Angular version that comes out. And how can I have a graceful fallback if I'm trying to automate this somehow, running a command, I don't want to end up in a situation where I have half of the work done and half of my projects still have the old logo. And then how do I ensure that I don't have to think about this the next time? Because I'm going to start working on the version 3 of, or the third edition of the book. So I first created the header component, as I mentioned. I still needed that in my library, so I can use this in all of my 150 plus projects. Secondly, as I mentioned, NX migration. When you have a plugin that is used in projects, you can actually have migrations in your plugin. And you can actually specifically say which version of your plugin would run these migrations. So let's say you are at 0.0.1, and then you say, no, at 0.0.2, I'm going to run these migrations as well. So when someone updates the package, automatically those migrations are run, and you have things updated throughout the workspace. And that is what I wanted. So I created this migration named replace app toolbar, and that basically is a Node.js script. So it goes through all the projects and it replaces the toolbar. And the goal for me was to run these migrations into both start and the final folder, which when I was envisioning it meant that I would have to just run these commands twice. And that would update all of my projects in both of the workspaces. So if I show you what happened with the migration, it actually looked something like this. So it would go and find my app component HTML, my TS file, my module file, because half of the files were standalone components, half of them were module based. It would look at the new toolbar or would construct it with the right variables. It would then try to find the existing toolbar, and then it would replace that with the new toolbar. So that was the migration that I wrote. And when I'm importing a new component from a library, then I would also have to add the import statement in either the component or the module, depending on if I'm using a standalone or not. When that was done, I had a commit, a super nice commit that had all these migrations. So if you look here, you can see on the left we have the old code, and on the right we have the right code or the new code. So here we are using the header. And if I keep going down, you will see that we also added the import for the header component. This was done automatically with the scripts that I mentioned. And if I keep going down, you're going to see the same for all of my components in both of my workspaces. So this single commit basically replaces everything in the start and the final folder for all of the projects that I just mentioned. So once I ran this, things were like muska, how we say in Pakistan. Does anyone know that word? No. That means buttery smooth. So, and the final result was basically this. So if I show you this project, you can see the new logo there that has the new component that we just talked about, and everything is consistent as well, and everything was working as before. This example, by the way, shows how you can lazily load components in a single page. Alrighty. And I think that was the moment when I actually felt like a self-proclaimed NX expert, because I've worked with the major core components, including generators for generating anything, for example, applications, for executors that you can run anytime on particular projects, and then also migration that you can consistently do for supporting your projects over time. So if I summarize what we did, we talked about cats are possum. We also talked about it's quite possible that we can manage 150 plus projects, and no solution is perfect. We always try to revive things, reevaluate, and then improve. And it's not too late to ever learn something new. When I started working on this, I had no idea how NX worked, but by the end of it, I actually know quite a lot that I can now replicate in my enterprise projects as well, and at my workplace as well. And NX is really, really good for monorepositories. If you want multiple applications in your organization or your team, which could have libraries, which could have multiple applications, both front-end and back-end, even React and Angular applications, you would use NX. And especially because you have one place for the dependencies, and all of the projects within an NX workspace basically share those dependencies, which makes things really easy. Having said that, I can also show you one thing before we wrap up, and we are doing really good with time. So this is the Angular Cookbook, second edition, and the site is called ng-cookbook.com. But if you go here, and now I'm just showing off, this is not part of the presentation at all. So talking about AI, I implemented this thing called the NG Cookbook AI. And if you go here and ask questions like who wrote the book, and you can see I don't know how to write a book, it actually goes and tries to figure out what is the context behind it. And you can see that it responds in a nice manner about me. It knows what the book is. How many of you know what kind of technique is used to do this in AI? RAG. So that's exactly what I'm using. I'm using Python, RAG, which is a technique which you can provide more context to a general model like ChatGPT or Google Gemini, but it knows about my book. If you go on this website, you can actually ask questions about Angular that you may not be asking me directly. For example, if you say how to implement route animations in Angular, what this basically does is that it's going to give you an answer of your question, of course. It's not going to give you any code from the book. Otherwise, my publisher would sue me for giving information for free. I don't want to do that. But what it would also do is give you the exact chapter from the book where you can find it. And it would also give you that demo link and also the GitHub link to directly the folder. So this is route animations in Angular from the book. And you can see, ooh, nice. And you can also see the exact folder, exact recipe that it gave as a link as well. So I would encourage you to try the ng-cookbook.com and see how this works. And with that, I thank you for listening to me for about 30 minutes. And I'm open to questions for now. Don't be shy. Ask anything. Yes.
Okay. It's not really a question, but I would like to learn more about NX workspaces.
Mhm.
I don't know what that is, really.
Yes. So it's, for example, when you create an Angular project with the engine new, you basically are creating an Angular CLI based projects. So you have a package JSON, you have a single application there. You can't really have multiple applications within a single Angular project. But when you create an NX workspace, you can create as a workspace with Angular application or with a React application because it creates an apps folder. I can actually show you how this looks like. So I think that would make much more sense. So this is my GitHub repository for this. And if you see here, you have the final folder that you can see right here, and you have the start folder. So if we talk about an NX workspace, this is an NX workspace. It has an NX JSON, which basically has NX based configuration, like which testing framework you're using. Here we are using Jest, which end-to-end testing tool we are using, what kind of generators we have, for example. So all those things are within the NX mono repository. But then you also have these folders. For example, you can create multiple applications within an NX mono repository. So all these folders, which were created by me, have recipes, and all of them share the same Angular dependencies. So they are all using the same Angular. If you wanted, you can also, go around and have multiple versions of Angular as well, but it's a bit more tricky. But that means that all of my applications use the same version. I can update the mono repository, and everything shares the same thing. And then you can also create libraries within. So, for example, if you have a UI library, a design component library that is going to be shared in all of the applications, you can actually create them here. So you can create UI-based libraries. You can create publishable libraries, which you can push to an NPM artifactory or the global NPM repositories. And you can also create business logic libraries, for example, API calls or whatever that could be in there. And you don't have to then repeat that for every other application as well. What's even nicer is that when you work with NX, you can also put guardrails as well. For example, you might have seen that there becomes a situation where one app is actually importing dependencies from the other app, and the other one is importing from here. So instead of doing this cross-referencing, you can actually put guardrails. What is the layer that we have in our project? For example, you would have a UI layer, you would have a business logic layer, and then you have a utils layer. You would always say that utils cannot import things from the app, and you can always say that apps can import only from the business logic layer, and business logic would use the UI layer. So you can do all of that as well. There's a really nice book from someone called Manfred Steuer. If I'm correct, he's actually from Germany, if I'm correct. And he has this book called Enterprise Angular. So I would encourage you to look into that because it talks about Angular for enterprise, but then also NX mono repositories alongside that. And with that, he also talks about domain-driven design when you want to scale it across teams, but putting those guardrails as well using something called Sheriff that I think he probably created or he's probably just promoting those. So with NX, that's also possible. So for huge teams, I think NX is a really good source for having your applications within them. And then you can also have things like if you want to add storybooks to your Angular applications, you can add that. If you want to add testing framework like Playwright, you can add that pretty easily just by running a command for NX, and it installs everything, it sets up everything as well. So you don't have to do a lot of those things manually. Cool, cool, cool. Any more questions? All right.
Okay, adjacent question to this one. So, from my personal experience working with several micro frontends, we are facing a kind of stupid issue with updating. So we have multiple projects, Angular projects, that share a common library, which is usual suspects. But the issue is that we also have a theming library, and now we don't want to update every single project every time that we update a theming library or when we update a common library. But we are also facing issues that several third-party components, they don't play nice with every single Angular update, and the Fuse theme that we are using also doesn't play nice with every single Angular update. So we are either slacking behind or we are facing major rework issues every couple of months. So continuing on this NX question, would a monorepo with NX workspace solve our problems?
Yes. So for example, what took me about 7 months of migrating 150 projects, when I wanted to migrate to Angular 19, it took me 1 hour. So that's like the difference that you would have. So every project worked on Angular 19, everything was converted to standalone components. And if you have an NX mono repository that looks at those projects, now you would have to look into if it supports the third-party libraries as well. I think that becomes a bit more complex because NX may or may not be supporting those. For example, NX supports a storybook. It supports, I think, Angular Material. It supports Jest. It supports Playwright. So those kind of things, NX has a wrapper of. So it's called NX Jest, NX Playwright, etc. So if you use NX and you use those tools, at least those would be automatically migrated. But I think when we talk about extremely custom or third-party libraries, that's still going to be a bit of a challenge. But I think still, since you would have only one NX workspace where you are loading the dependency, you won't have to do it for every single application. You just do it for the workspace and everything is updated. And then you just, if you find an issue, then you just fix that particular issue. So it will still save you some time. In terms of complexity, I think it would reduce the complexity, but it would probably not eliminate the complexity.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for asking. More questions? Oh.
Yes, so I was wondering if you have any experience in migrating a big web application from Angular to React, and if you have any, I don't know, maybe you haven't done that, but if you have any advice on that.
Ooh, I think it's hard to say without looking at the project. I know that, and also it depends on the Angular version as well. I know that Angular 1.5x applications had a nicer migration to Vue.js applications, not particularly React. But then I think it could be possible to have, if you have web components instead of Angular components, it's easier to move. But I think when we talk about Angular to React, it's going to be a one-on-one migration. So I think I haven't come across any automated tool that does that really nicely. I did one migration, I think that was like 7 years ago, but we had to do it manually. But I'm not sure if there are any good tools today that supports the migration. I know of companies that definitely do this. They're like, okay, we're gonna take off your old Angular project that nobody loves anymore. We're gonna migrate that, but no tools that I know of, unfortunately.
Just one question. I didn't really quite understand if you, in your case, if you had 150 separate Angular projects from the beginning, or if they were generated as and if you were using ng from the start.
Yes, so I wrote 2 books. So for the first book, I actually created ng new, and I created all the projects in a GitHub repository. That's why I had to migrate all of them, because they were 150 projects. But when I started working on the second book, I actually started by creating an NX workspace first, and then I created all those 150 projects using the tools that I built for myself. So I created a plugin, generators, executors, and then I ran all these commands 150 times. And then I created those projects, but they were done much faster than if I had done it, separately, so to say.
So you like migrated the code from you migrated into NX first.
Yes. So I created the workspace first, NX first. It was an empty NX workspace, and then I created those projects myself.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
No problem. I'm going to be around. If you're feeling shy, you can just grab me and ask questions. No problem at all.
Was that it? Okay, we're in for an early lunch then.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you for joining. Thank you.